Hello and welcome, friends, especially those of you who still believe that honor, truth, and loyalty aren't just old values, they're the foundation of a strong nation. Tonight's story is for you. You've seen the world change, but you've held the line. And tonight, you'll see what happens when real strength, not celebrity, not spin, steps onto the stage. Karoline Leavitt didn't just defend a man or a policy, she defended every hardworking American who's been laughed at, dismissed, and underestimated. Settle in, because this isn't just a debate, it's a moment you'll remember. Let's dive into what really happened that night. It was supposed to be a night of reverence, an artist tribute gala in Manhattan's Upper West Side, where tuxedos outnumbered flags and champagne drowned out prayer. But as Gere took the stage under the chandeliers, something shifted. The actor, once America's golden screen icon, leaned into the microphone and delivered a line that would echo far beyond Broadway. If a man can't build love in his own home, how can he lead a nation? There was no mistaking the target. The crowd inside the Lincoln Arts Center laughed and clapped, their polished approval rising like steam. But thousands of miles away in small-town bars and veterans' halls, the reaction was colder. Silent, even. They didn't laugh. They listened. And what they heard wasn't wit. It was betrayal. Not just of one man, but of a code older than any political party. Don't smear another man's family to score points. That line, spoken so carelessly in a room full of people who'd never patched a roof or filled out a VA claim, struck like a slap across the heartland. The next morning, talk radio flared up like wildfire. Hosts asked if Gere had finally crossed a line. Men called in steelworkers, truckers, retirees, saying they'd had enough of Hollywood treating faith and family like disposable props. Through it all, the White House stayed quiet. Karoline Leavitt, President Trump's press secretary, didn't tweet, didn't post. She just watched, listened. At 27, she knew that real power wasn't in reacting fast. It was in waiting for the right moment to answer loud. That moment would come days later under different lights on a different stage, but in that quiet, between Gere's smirk and Leavitt's silence, a storm was already building. And for millions of men who had seen their values mocked for years, it felt like someone finally heard them. This wasn't about policy, it was about pride, and someone had just lit a match. The Liberty Forum Theater wasn't built for politics, it was built for music, country music. Its oak stage had once creaked beneath the boots of legends, the air thick with the smell of leather jackets and worn guitar strings. Located just a few blocks off Nashville's main drag, it had been a sanctuary of storytelling for over 70 years. But tonight, the seats weren't filled with fans clutching ticket stubs, they were filled with citizens carrying something heavier: expectation. Outside, pickup trucks lined the street like sentinels, their tailgates still dusted from gravel roads. Inside, the mood was quiet but tense, like the hush before a rifle crack. The marquee didn't advertise a concert, it simply read, "Voices of the Nation, Leavitt vs. Gere." The crowd had begun filing in hours before showtime. You could spot the differences by row. On the left balcony sat college kids in denim jackets with pins and slogans, sipping lattes from reusable bottles and waving handmade "Gere Speaks Truth" signs. But the floor? That belonged to the working men, steelworkers from Pittsburgh in ball caps, veterans from Knoxville with faded service patches, retired coal miners from West Virginia, arms crossed, boots planted like fence posts. These weren't men chasing spectacle. They were men who had lived through the consequences of bad leadership, and they had come not to cheer, but to listen. Some hadn't been to a political event in years. Others had driven overnight, not for Trump, not even for the party, but because they were tired of being lectured by men who lived behind gates and cameras. The kind of men who wouldn't last a day on a factory floor, but felt entitled to judge how real families lived. Backstage, the studio crew prepped the scene like a prize fight. 2 chairs, 1 host, lights hot enough to bake truth from skin. At center stage stood Nora Chandler, the host of Voices of the Nation. Once a serious journalist, now she was something else entirely, part moderator, part master of ceremonies. Her silver suit glinted under the rigging lights as she paced behind the curtain, rehearsing her first line. She didn't care who won, she cared about ratings, but even she could feel it. This wasn't going to be a talk show. It was going to be a reckoning. The final piece was the silence, the kind that doesn't come from absence, but from pressure. As the music faded and the cameras panned wide, Nora stepped into the spotlight, the crowd rising not with cheers but with breath held. The moment had arrived. Tonight, the Liberty Forum wasn't a theater. It was a battlefield dressed in wood and velvet. And for the men in the room, those who had raised barns, buried brothers, and sat through years of condescension from glittering coasts, it felt like, for once, they weren't the audience. They were the jury. And judgment was coming. The applause that greeted Richard Gere as he stepped onto the stage was polite but scattered. A few enthusiastic claps from the balcony rang out. Students, artists, the kinds of people who'd grown up idolizing the silver screen. But on the ground level, where the hard-backed seats were filled with men whose hands bore the marks of real work, the mood was far more restrained. They watched him like one might watch a man in a tailored suit walk into a mechanic's shop to explain how to fix an engine. He was still Richard Gere, still the man from Pretty Woman, still the face that once lit up 1,000 theaters, but now, in his 60s, he wore more than just age. He wore opinion. Heavy, rehearsed opinion. He stood in a navy suit that probably cost more than a month's wages for half the crowd, his silver hair brushed back like he'd just stepped off a Vanity Fair cover shoot. But he didn't start with a joke. No charm, no warmth. Just a long pause, the kind actors are taught to use for effect. Then, in a voice measured and low, he began. "I've traveled the world," he said, looking not at the audience but into the camera. "I've met people rebuilding from genocide, parents raising children in war zones, and activists risking everything for dignity." He paced slowly, each word falling with purpose. "And yet, back home, in the nation I love, we confuse leadership with domination, with silence, with image. We applaud a man who cannot build warmth in his own home and call him strong." A murmur rippled through the crowd. On the left side of the theater, heads nodded. Someone from the balcony whispered, "Exactly." But down front, brows furrowed. Veterans shifted in their seats. A retired sheriff from Alabama leaned forward, arms folded. One man clenched his jaw tight enough to crack a walnut. Gere didn't stop. "Leadership," he said, "is not about ruling. It's about reflecting. It's about being human, fallible, connected." He smiled, the kind of half-smile that once sold movie tickets. "So, yes, I question President Trump's relationship with his wife. Because if you can't show love to the person beside you, how can you ask 300 million people to trust you?" That was the line, the one that turned polite restraint into hard silence. A few hands clapped in the balcony, unsure. But below, someone muttered, "You don't know him." Another voice followed, louder. "What do you know about love, Hollywood?" Gere paused, as if surprised that anyone had the nerve to interrupt. He looked out into the house, eyes narrowing just slightly. "I'm not judging," he said. "I'm observing." But the line didn't land the way he hoped. It sounded like deflection. Like the kind of thing people say after they've said too much. Host Nora Chandler, sitting stage left in her metallic suit, leaned forward with the precision of a showrunner sensing the spark. "Mr. Gere," she said, "you've painted a pretty bleak picture of this administration. Some would call it brave. Others might call it personal." Gere smiled again, this time tighter. "We've normalized coldness in the name of control," he said. "But I think America is ready for warmth again. For truth." The crowd didn't explode. It didn't even stir. Because this wasn't Manhattan. This was Nashville. And in this room, truth wasn't a performance. It was earned, not spoken. And as Gere sat down, his posture relaxed, his tone serene. He seemed unaware that the people before him weren't just watching a celebrity. They were evaluating a man, the kind of man who had just stepped into a furnace he didn't understand, a man about to face someone who knew what fire really felt like. Karoline Leavitt hadn't spoken a word yet, but every man on the floor knew it was coming, and it wasn't going to be gentle. The lights dimmed for only a second, but in that second, the air inside the Liberty Forum Theater seemed to change. A low murmur swept across the crowd as a figure emerged stage right, framed in a blaze of amber-white light that spilled across the floor like sunrise. She didn't stride with flair. She didn't wave like a politician. She walked with purpose, unshaken, composed, and unmistakably present. Karoline Leavitt, at 27 years old, wasn't just the youngest White House press secretary in modern history. She was something rarer, a calm in the chaos, a sharpened mind in a world spinning on noise. The red blazer she wore wasn't a costume, it wasn't a brand, it was armor. Cut sharp at the shoulders, it flared slightly at the hips, just enough to suggest poise, not fashion. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a firm knot, and in her right hand she carried a slim leather folder. No iPad, no coffee cup, just a folder, tightly gripped, deliberate, like something you don't let go of unless you're ready to draw blood. The audience on the right side of the room, the veterans, tradesmen, retired factory managers, rose to their feet with quiet reverence. There were no chants, no signs waving like wildfires, just nods, just respect. She took her seat across from Richard Gere, who turned toward her with the ghost of a smile. But if he expected her to acknowledge him, he was disappointed. Karoline's eyes didn't waver. They settled on host Nora Chandler, who now looked like she was holding a lit fuse. Nora leaned in slightly, ever the instigator. "Miss Leavitt," she said smoothly, "Mr. Gere has offered a portrait of President Trump's personal life. He called it cold, distant, even damaging to the country's moral compass. I imagine you have a different take?" Karoline took a breath, not a deep one, just enough. Her voice rang out, clear, firm, grounded. "Nora," she began, "Mr. Gere has spent a lifetime on stages pretending to be other people. I've spent the last 3 years standing beside a real one." A ripple moved through the conservative half of the room. She continued, turning her head just enough to meet Gere's gaze for the first time. "You speak of warmth, Mr. Gere, like it's something soft. But where I come from, where men raise barns before dawn and mothers hold 2 jobs just to pay for school lunches, warmth isn't a feeling, it's a choice. It's what people do in hard times to protect the ones they love." Gere blinked, lips parting slightly, but Karoline didn't stop. "You want to talk about leadership? It's not found in dinner parties or directors' chairs. It's found in late-night briefings, in decisions no one sees, in staying when it's easier to walk away." She leaned forward, ever so slightly. "You judge a marriage from across the country, but you've never once asked the families who feel safer because of him. You don't know the trucker who finally found work, the veteran who got a call back from the VA, the single mother who just got her first refund in a decade. You see press releases, we see people—" The audience erupted, not wild, but proud, like applause with a backbone. A man near the back called out, "That's real!" Karoline didn't flinch. She turned back to Nora. "This is the problem. We have actors judging leaders and calling it truth. But truth doesn't live in scripts, it lives in service." Even Nora, who had once brought senators to tears, nodded, caught off guard by the sheer weight of the moment. Gere tried to interrupt, lifting a hand, but Karoline cut him off without raising her voice. "I'll let you respond," she said, "but I haven't finished speaking for the people you pretend to understand." She set the leather folder gently on the table between them, and in that moment the entire room felt it, not just the tension but the shift. This wasn't going to be a debate. It was going to be a lesson. And Karoline Leavitt had come prepared to teach. The silence that followed Karoline Leavitt's opening remarks wasn't empty. It was charged, like the stillness before a thunderclap. Nora Chandler, sensing the tension thickening between the guests, leaned back in her chair, hands folded, eyes alert. Her job tonight wasn't just to moderate, it was to hold the line between order and spectacle, and right now, both were teetering. Richard Gere shifted in his seat, his smile thinning into a line of determination. His tone changed, less poetic now, more defensive, more clipped. "Ms. Leavitt," he began, "you've painted a noble picture of hardship, and I don't doubt your sincerity, but I've walked through refugee camps. I've seen children torn from families, women forced into silence. Leadership, real leadership, is rooted in compassion. And what I see in this administration is control, not care." The liberal side of the crowd stirred again, murmurs of support flaring up, but the working men in the lower rows, The ones with calloused hands and worn boots weren't moved. They'd heard that tone before, from politicians, from celebrities, from journalists who parachuted in for a headline and then left before the work started. Karoline didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, calm and still, as if measuring the words for the weight they deserved. Then she spoke. "You saw suffering in refugee camps, and that's honorable," she said, nodding. "But have you ever seen it in a factory town where the lights haven't been on since 2008? Have you ever sat across from a man who spent 30 years on the line only to be told he's too angry to be part of the new America?" Her voice didn't rise, it deepened. "You talk about compassion, but for whom? You've built your truth on the global stage, Mr. Gere. We're building ours on the front porch, one mortgage at a time." A ripple of applause broke out, then grew. Someone in the crowd called out, "That's the truth right there!" Gere bristled slightly, his expression tight, but he recovered. "So is that it?" he asked. "If someone disagrees with your version of America, they don't get to speak?" Karoline leaned forward, hands folded gently in front of her. "No," she said, "they get to speak, but they don't get to speak without being answered." Then she turned to the audience, scanning faces that looked like the ones she grew up around, men who'd raised barns and buried brothers, who'd held on to faith even when the world laughed at them. "There are two Americas in this room tonight," she said. "One that believes character is built in air-conditioned studios, and one that knows it's forged in broken-down trucks and unpaid overtime. And the second one is tired of being told to stay quiet while the first writes all the scripts." The crowd roared, not like a concert, not like a protest, but like a gathering of men who had waited too long for someone to say what they'd known in their bones, that the country wasn't broken because of division. It was bruised because one side kept dismissing the other. Gere straightened his shoulders, clearly trying to regain footing. "I'm not dismissing anyone," he said quickly, his tone threading the line between clarity and frustration. "I'm calling for empathy, for reflection, because if we can't ask hard questions of our leaders, we're just living in denial." But Karoline didn't blink. "Hard questions are fair," she replied. "But what you did wasn't a question, it was a performance. You didn't ask, you assumed. You took one woman's quiet strength and turned it into your evidence of a man's failure. That's not leadership, that's projection." And there it was, the line that landed like a hammer, not angry, not loud, just final, the kind of line that makes men shift in their chairs and remember the times they'd been misjudged. Gere opened his mouth again, but Nora held up a hand, her voice cool, professional. "We'll return to that point shortly," she said, clearly feeling the balance of power had shifted. She turned to the camera, her voice deepening with gravity. "What we're seeing tonight is more than a debate. It's a reckoning between two worlds, two moral compasses, two ideas of what America should be." And she was right. In the theater seats sat welders beside engineers, soldiers beside scholars, fathers beside sons, and each of them saw something familiar in this collision. Not just politics, but pain. Not just a clash of words, but a battle for how their lives would be remembered. The script was no longer in Hollywood's hands. The room had turned, and it was Karoline Leavitt, not the actor across from her, who held the pen now. It started not with a bang, but with the soft sound of leather sliding across wood. Karoline Leavitt rested the slim folder she had carried since stepping on stage onto the table between her and Richard Gere. It sat there, quiet and ominous like a sealed verdict in a courtroom. The crowd hushed, instinctively sensing something was about to shift. Richard Gere glanced down at it briefly, then back at her face, his expression wary, uncertain. The man who had spoken with such confidence earlier now sat straighter, his hand tightening on the armrest, not out of defiance, but preparation. Nora Chandler, ever the showwoman, knew when to step back. She didn't ask, she didn't narrate. She simply looked at Karoline and nodded, giving her the floor. Karoline folded her hands and looked straight ahead, not at Gere, not at the camera, but at the crowd. "Mr. Gere," she began, her voice steady, "has spent the evening discussing love, leadership, and truth. He's warned us against coldness and questioned loyalty, and yet," she tapped the folder once, Few in this room know that 5 years ago, Mr. Gere wrote a letter, on official letterhead, to President Donald J. Trump. A few murmurs broke out, but Karoline didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Every man in that room knew what it meant when someone brought out a paper trail. This wasn't about impressions anymore. This was about facts. In this letter, she continued, Mr. Gere praised the president's clarity, called his America First agenda refreshing, and requested funding for a humanitarian film project his foundation was producing in sub-African American Africa. Now the murmurs swelled. Nora looked toward Gere, whose face had paled slightly, his jaw tight. Karoline opened the folder with deliberate calm. A single sheet. Presidential letterhead, the kind that doesn't get tossed around lightly. In his own words, Karoline said, reading aloud, "You are the only leader in the free world willing to challenge the cultural decay I see spreading through Western entertainment. I hope to collaborate with your administration to remind the world that moral clarity is still possible through art." She paused, letting the words sink in. The silence was thunderous. One man in the audience muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." Another shook his head, visibly stunned. Gere leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "That letter was private," he began, but Karoline cut in, still calm. "You made your judgment public. I'm simply returning the favor." The audience erupted. Not in chaos, but in knowing outrage. Men who had been patient all evening now stood, arms crossed, nodding. They'd seen this movie before. Someone who spoke the people's language in private, then threw them under the bus when it suited their reputation. It wasn't the hypocrisy that stung most. It was the cowardice. Nora, struggling to maintain composure, turned to Gere. "Mr. Gere, do you deny writing this?" Gere didn't respond right away. He looked trapped, not by words, but by his own. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. Finally, he spoke. "I wrote it at a different time. The world has changed." Karoline leaned forward now, her voice still measured. "No, Mr. Gere, you changed. The world just kept watching." She closed the folder with a soft snap that echoed louder than any applause. "You said tonight that leadership is about compassion, but true compassion doesn't vanish when the cameras are off. It doesn't beg in private and condemn in public." Gere sat motionless, the polished veneer gone. For the first time that evening he looked small, not because Karoline had humiliated him, but because she had revealed him. And what she revealed was weakness dressed in principle, the kind of weakness that smiled for donors while scoffing at welders, the kind that lectures about connection but has none with the people who turn the gears of this country. The conservative crowd surged in applause, not wild but steady, the kind of applause you give when someone has done the hard thing without flinching. Karoline didn't bask in it. She simply turned to Nora, folded her hands again, and said, "I yield." That single phrase, so simple, felt like a closing gavel. Gere looked down, his face unreadable. But the damage was done. Not by theatrics, not by drama, by evidence. And for the men in that room, many of whom had been accused, dismissed, and overlooked for holding to values that others mocked, this was a moment of reckoning they hadn't seen in years. The mask was off, and the actor, for all his lines, had nothing left to say. The Liberty Forum Theater had fallen quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that follows resolution. It was heavier. It was the silence that settles after a man has been stripped of pretense, not by insults, but by his own forgotten truth. Richard Gere sat frozen, his shoulders hunched forward just slightly, as if something in him had caved in. The once commanding voice, the actor's polished cadence, the calculated eye contact, gone. In its place was a man who realized too late that the spotlight he once owned now illuminated everything he didn't want seen. On stage, Gere tried to recover, leaning toward the mic with a half-hearted attempt at explanation. "This isn't what it looks like," he muttered, voice thin. But the words evaporated. There was no script left to save him. The conservative side of the audience remained seated, not because they didn't support Karoline, but because standing would have made it feel like a show. This wasn't a standing ovation moment. It was a head nod moment, a that's how you do it moment. Nora Chandler cleared her throat gently, stepping in like a referee sensing one fighter could no longer continue. "Thank you, Mr. Gere," she said, her voice even. "We'll let the audience judge for themselves." She turned to Karoline, whose expression remained calm, composed. Not triumphant, just finished. Backstage, production assistants stared at screens, unsure how to reset the tone. On X, the internet began to swell with clips, quotes, and frame-by-frame breakdowns. But inside the theater, none of that mattered yet. Here, the only thing that did was that a man who had once represented moral superiority had just been met, not with rage, but with facts. And facts, especially when presented without cruelty, leave no room to run. Richard Gere remained seated as the cameras pulled back, his hands clasped tightly, his gaze distant. For all the roles he'd played in his life, none had ever required this much truth, and none had ever left him so profoundly alone on stage. As the camera light faded slightly and the stage settled into a cooler hue, Nora Chandler turned once more to Karoline Leavitt, not as a host chasing ratings, but as a witness to something greater than debate. "Karoline," she asked quietly, "you've stunned the nation tonight. Before we close, do you have any final words for the American people watching?" Karoline turned slowly toward the camera, her gaze steady, not performative but purposeful. "I didn't come here tonight to win an argument," she said. "I came here to defend something bigger than headlines or applause. I came to stand for the families who turn off the TV when Hollywood mocks their values, for the men who wake up before dawn and still make time to coach their son's little league team, for the women who pray over dinner in kitchens no movie camera will ever see." A murmur of approval moved through the audience. Not wild, not coordinated, just quiet, deep affirmation. She continued, "We've let too many people who don't understand America speak on behalf of it. Mr. Gere came here tonight to judge a man's home, his marriage, his leadership. I came here to remind Americans what real leadership looks like. President Trump doesn't lead for headlines," she continued. "He leads for the father trying to make his mortgage, the grandmother raising her grandkids, the farmer fixing his tractor by flashlight, the forgotten, the mocked, the counted out." Then she turned briefly toward Gere, no venom, no smirk, just honesty. "You judge the man, but you never once looked at the people he serves." She looked back to the audience, calm and final. "I serve them too. That's why I'm here." The room was still, no roar of applause, just dozens of men and women nodding silently, some with tears in their eyes, others with arms crossed in proud agreement. The kind of silence that only comes when something sacred has been restored. Weeks had passed since the night at Liberty Forum Theater, but the echo hadn't faded. It had only deepened. Across the country, in barbershops, truck stops, American Legion halls, and breakfast diners, people still talked about it. Not as entertainment, but as a turning point. Something had shifted, not just in media, but in the air. Richard Gere, once a household name, had quietly canceled his public appearances. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt wasn't just remembered, she was repeated. Her words were quoted on veteran forums, printed on bumper stickers, even stitched into ball caps sold at county fairs. But it wasn't fandom, it was recognition. She had spoken a quiet truth that many felt, but didn't have the microphone to say. One trucker in Indiana posted a photo of her with the caption, "She talks like my wife and fights like my platoon sergeant." Thousands shared it because they knew the difference between noise and backbone. For those who had watched the culture drift for decades, it was more than a political moment, it was a course correction. A signal that dignity still had a place on stage, and that maybe, just maybe, America still knew how to listen when the right person stood up to speak. The story of Karoline Leavitt and Richard Gere reminds us that, in a world saturated with noise, real strength still lies in restraint, truth, and unwavering principle. It wasn't anger or theatrics that turned the tide that night, it was composure. It was the quiet, deliberate force of a woman standing for something bigger than herself, the dignity of work, the sanctity of family, the value of loyalty. For too long, many Americans, especially those who built this country with their hands and honored it with their silence, felt forgotten by a culture obsessed with appearances. Karoline's victory wasn't just a political win, it was a cultural correction. It proved that no amount of celebrity polish can stand against a simple, steady truth backed by evidence and courage. In a divided age, the lesson is clear. Character still matters. Performance fades, but authenticity endures. America doesn't need more actors on stages, it needs men and women willing to defend what's real when it's hardest. Karoline Leavitt's stand wasn't just for a president, it was for every American who refuses to be spoken over, belittled, or forgotten again.